This is an acrylic palette. This has been set out according to the colour wheel. So this is lemon yellow, this is cadmium yellow, this is cadmium red, this is crimson, this is ultramarine, this is phthalo blue. Lemon yellow is a greenish yellow, cadmium yellow is an orangey yellow, cadmium red is an orangey red, crimson is a bluish red, ultramarine is a reddish blue, phthalo blue is a greenish blue. So in terms of the organisation of the colour, you could think about this as the colour wheel. When you're organising a palette, it makes sense to put the colours which are closest to each other on the colour wheel next to each other on your colour palette. You'll also note that I've put my colours on the extreme edge of my palette, enabling me to have the max amount of space to mix my colour. That's basic kind of organisation of colour. The white that we've got on here is a titanium white. Titanium white is an opaque white rather than a transparent white. For this colour exercise we're going to be using titanium white because we want a colour which is an opaque white instead of a transparent white. However, if you wanted to retain the luminosity of colour, then zinc white or mixing white would be your preferred option. We're going to be creating a colour wheel now, and I want to talk you through that. So now we're going to apply that understanding to the making of the colour wheel. So we need to think a little bit about the organisation of colour, and as you can already see, I've placed our colour palette around the edge of the colour wheel. So we'll start with a little bit of lemon yellow, and I'm going to put that on with my finger, and I'm going to put a little bit of lemon yellow in the middle. I'm then going to apply with my next finger a bit of cadmium yellow, and I'm going to mix the two together. I'm now going to move around to the next segment. Again, small finger, clean finger, cadmium red. Put a little bit of that in the middle. Crimson here. Mix the two together in the middle. Then I'm going to move around to this side, changing fingers again. Making sure each time I'm using clean fingers, so I've now got ultramarine. Put a little bit of ultramarine in the middle. There you go, blue. Over here. Mix those two together. And what I've tried to do is, by mixing the two blues together, I'm trying to neutralise the blue. Mixing the two reds, neutralise the red. Mixing the two yellows, neutralise the yellows. We're not going to be using these middle colours, however, because that's going to affect the secondary colours that we mix. So we're now going to look at those colours which are adjacent to each other on the colour wheel, so cadmium yellow and cadmium red. As I've already identified, if we were to mix equal amounts of one colour to the other colour, we wouldn't necessarily produce a colour which is midway. In fact, the cadmium red is much stronger than the cadmium yellow. So if we mix the 50-50, we can have much more of a reddy orange. So I'm now going to put that inside there. This one over here. Just going to modify that a little tiny bit. I can add a little bit more yellow over here. So you can see the idea is that we've got mostly yellow here, with a small little bit of cadmium red, a little bit less yellow, a bit more cadmium red, a bit more cadmium red on here, and hopefully we've got a nice even transition between here and here. So you may be wondering why we're doing this, but obviously one of the key things to understand is that these colours are warm or cool for a reason. So for instance, if we take cadmium yellow, then if cadmium yellow is a yellow with a small amount of red in it, and cadmium red is red with a small amount of yellow in it, then really what we're mixing together here is simply yellow and red. If one was to be thinking about cadmium red, which has a small amount of yellow in it, and we were mixing that with phthalo blue, a blue with a small amount of yellow in it, then what we'd be mixing together if we mix this colour and this colour would be red, yellow and blue. So therefore we would get a more brownish or a kind of greyish purple rather than a really beautiful purple. So looking at the colours now, ultramarine is closest to crimson. We're going to mix those two together. And now finally, we're going to go to the greens. This time I'll swap fingers because I've run out of clean fingers. So that's our basic colour wheel mixed. Obviously you can decide to use a brush if you wish, or you could do all of this with a palette knife. You might decide to do an enlarged version of this. But for the moment what we're considering is those colours which are closest to each other on the colour wheel, which are going to produce the most saturated secondary colours. Well, we've got a pure combination of, say, lemon yellow here, which is a yellow with a small amount of blue in it, the phthalo blue, which is blue with a small amount of yellow in it. Again here we've just got the mixture of yellow and blue. With the ultramarine and crimson, just the combination of red and blue. When we look over here, what we're going to see is that we can also produce other oranges which include those other yellows and other red combinations that we have already identified. So we can think about the idea of our cadmium yellow and our cadmium red. And obviously that's going to produce quite a saturated, quite an intense orange. We can think about our cadmium yellow and our crimson. And we've got to be mindful of the amounts that we're using. If we now think about our lemon yellow and our cadmium red, and finally our lemon yellow and our crimson. Now it's not really like the fact that these colours are wrong, it's just that their saturation is going to be different. And when we consider the fact that we live in Northern Europe, so we look through 80% moisture, and the great majority of the colours that we see are desaturated colours, then it's really useful to see what these kinds of oranges are. If we go to the violet, we can think about, again, those colours which are closest to each other on the colour wheel, so the crimson and the ultramarine. We can then compare that with the cadmium red and the ultramarine. Then the cadmium red and the actually got the order of that wrong. Of course, I've realised now that I've put the warm cadmium red here and the warm blue here, so I'm just going to swap that around. That should be cadmium red and phthalo blue. And finally, the phthalo blue and the crimson. Okay, we can see how strong that phthalo blue is. So I've mixed the order of those up. I just need to remember what ones I've put together. And then we go on to the green. So our lemon yellow and our phthalo blue. Our lemon yellow and our ultramarine. Our cadmium yellow and our phthalo blue. And finally our cadmium yellow and our ultramarine. So we can see that we can produce 4 quite different greens, 4 quite different purples, 4 quite different oranges with our various colour combinations. That gives us a basic introduction to the colour wheel. When you are mixing up colours, it's important to remember that different colours have different dye stuffs in them. So for instance, if I take an amount of a lemon yellow and an amount of phthalo blue, roughly equivalent to each other, and I mix them together, what I'm not going to produce is a mid-green. The dye stuff of the phthalo blue is really, really strong, so I'm going to produce quite a dark bluish green. If I take a larger amount of lemon yellow and quite a small amount of phthalo blue and mix them together, then the result that I'm going to achieve is more like a mid-green. I could take a small amount of that mid-green and add some lemon yellow to that to produce obviously a lighter green. I could add a small amount of that green to this green to modify it further. So colour mixing really is about controlling the amount of colour that you use. A painting knife or a palette knife is an ideal tool because you can really quickly clean in between. Obviously, if I add more phthalo blue to the equation, then very, very quickly that result will be very, very strong. Sometimes it's quite difficult to see the nature of the hue that you've produced. And occasionally, a little tiny amount of white will lift that colour and it's easier to see the result of that colour. So essentially, certain colours have stronger dyes in them than others. Lemon yellow is quite weak in comparison to phthalo blue. Crimson is quite weak in comparison to cadmium red. The more you mix your colour, the more familiar you become. But certainly organising your palette according to the colour wheel makes a great deal of sense.